Hi, you've reached Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to build the new Cruzbike V20c. This all-new V20 model combines the lightweight of the aluminum mainframe with the stiffness and comfort of a carbon front end. As you can see here, we have an all-new carbon fiber front end. We have a carbon fiber slider, carbon fiber boom with a new aluminum end cap with some light mounts there up front, carbon fiber chainstay, matched down to our new carbon fiber fork. The carbon fiber fork features an oversized bearing, flat mount disc brakes front and rear. All right, as you can see here, we've already taken the packaging off of our frame and our parts. Let's go over everything we're going to need. We have our wheel set, 12 millimeter through axle. Make sure the caps are on before you proceed with throwing away any packaging. Sometimes those caps can come off in the packaging. You want to make sure that they are attached to both ends of both hubs. Here we have our main frame. Handlebars are pre-cabled, which we'll do some adjusting later. Front end, carbon fiber boom and chainstay. Our cables, you'll note, go through the interior of the headset and down through the fork, so we have some internal cabling. We'll go over that a bit later. We also have our seat and pad, carbon fiber chainstay, seat yoke. We have our front derailleur stock. We have pedals. We also have front derailleur and threaded mount for the axle. We have our slider bolt clamps and washers, 2 washers on the carbon fiber, headrest pad, headrest tubes, our main frame with our brakes pre-installed, Perez clamp pre-installed, fork pre-installed in the frame, derailleur on the Complete, pre-mounted and ready to go. Now everything on here will need adjustment when you're done for wheels with disc brakes, so please note that you will still need to do some adjustment after everything is put together. All right, let's talk about the carbon fiber parts and the torque for the bolts. Every frame and Complete comes with this sheet. This gives you all of the number of bolts, the size, and the torque specs in Newton meters for all these fasteners. For example, here we have the torque specs for the handlebars are 5 Newton meters. As you can see, the one that varies is the pinch bolt at 10 Newton meters. Okay, we're going to set this aside for later and use it as reference as we go along. But here we have our torque wrench. You're going to need something like this. You're going to need a small torque wrench with the ability to fit an M4 and an M5 Allen. We're going to use that when we do all of our attaching to our carbon fiber parts, such as the chainstay here. We have our inserts there, but we want to follow the torque specs so we don't over torque these parts and strip them out. This is very important. Now, very important too, if you have a torque wrench, to leave it set all the way at 0 in storage. And then for this one, this model that I have, it just dials at the bottom. And we dial it up until the line lines up with the Newton meters that we need. Like for example, our bottom bracket clamp is a 1-piece aluminum piece, but it's bolting into the carbon fiber chainstay, and we don't want to strip that out. Now, I highly recommend a torque wrench specially made for the very small amount of torque that we're going to need. Some torque wrenches do not go this low, so make sure you get one that can dial all the way down to that 5 Newton meters that we want. This particular one, we just turn it until the white line hits our number that we want. And yours may vary. And then it clicks when we hit the torque that we want, so we can't over tighten our bolts. We'll set this aside and use this one when you assemble our front end. All right, the first thing I like to do is pre-grease all of my parts. So here I have the through axles. I put a little bit of grease on the threads already in advance. I've also pre-greased all of my bolts. Here my slider bolt, where we have 2 washers, put a little grease on there. Very important to note, you have 2 washers, not 3, on the carbon, and 1 washer goes on the outside of each side. So we'll go across that when we get there again. And here also in our pack we have a small section of front cable housing and a cable adjuster for when we put our front derailleur together. We also have the threaded insert. This is for our front chainstay with a 2.5 millimeter Allen that threads into the backside of the derailleur hanger. This is what clamps our front end together. Very important to have this piece ready to go when we assemble our chainstay. And here we have our handlebar bolts. Again, I have pre-greased them a little bit, making sure everything's nice and smooth. We also have our chain and, as always, our quick link. We have our derailleur post. Everything should be mostly pre-assembled there. You'll note that it bolts in from the bottom, and everything only goes on one way. So we have a notched side for our little bracket. Everything should be nice and tight. We have our pulley wheel attached for the cable, and we're ready to go. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install our derailleur mast into our chainstay. The only time we would take this out is if we were going to be running a 1x chainring, for example. But here we have a double. So on the top of the chainstay, we're going to insert our mast down into the hole. Make sure everything is aligned and hold it in place. And on the back side, that's where we will thread our bolt through the stay on the bottom. We want to make sure we have that nice larger fender washer underneath to spread out the forces. And then we will use our 5 millimeter Allen to tighten that up. Now there's no torque specs on this. You just want to make sure it's nice and snug to prevent movement. It's a very, very thick piece here, so it should be good to snug it down. You're more likely on this one to strip out the bolt than damage the carbon. Once we have everything nice and secure there, we're ready for the next step. Now our next step after having the stock installed onto our front chainstay is we're going to install the derailleur to the right side of the chainstay. So this is a 2-piece endeavor. We have the derailleur side, and then we also have the threaded insert that goes inside of there to thread the front axle. So what we want to do here is we want to have our Allen at the ready. Again, this is a small 2.5 Allen. And as you can note here, we have a recess for the derailleur to sit in. Now, the derailleur is already mounted. We want to make sure that everything is nice and secure and that the B-limit screw is up against the flat end of the derailleur. And that's going to set right inside there in the little groove. And then the threaded insert goes on the outside and then bolts right in, right through the chainstay into the derailleur hanger. We'll make sure this is nice and secure. As always, use the flat end of the Allen wrench if you're using ball end wrenches on these smaller ones. They tend to strip out if you use the ball end. Once that's nice and secure, we're going to get our handy wheel stand, my favorite in order to build the Cruzbike. Once we have our wheel stand ready, we're going to take our front wheel and insert our front wheel into the wheel stand and reposition the front end. It's a little bit of a juggling act here since all this stuff is kind of pre-cabled and it's all running through the head tube and through the steer tube now, as opposed to before. But once we have everything set, we can simply lift it up and set the fork down onto the hub. Make sure we have our through axle at the ready. We have our little tool that fits in the inside of our through axle, but this won't fit through the hub unless we remove it. So make sure that the tool is removed from the axle. And then here, as you can see, we can use it to tighten our through axle once we've inserted it. So we're going to have that at the ready. Once all our tools and axle is in position, we will then be able to lift up the front end, being very careful not to chip any paint, and simply lift the front end up over the wheel and down onto the hub. Now, once we have our fork over our hub, we can take our chainstay and we can very carefully manipulate it up and over. Just get our cable out of the way here, up and over the wheel, making sure our cable is not bent, and we will position it right over our fork. And then we will take our through axle and maneuver that through axle through the chainstay, through the fork, into the hub, and work it all the way through to the other side. Everything should line up nice and square for us to be able to thread that through axle all the way tight. Now, when it's loose, we can have all this adjustment. So we have all the adjustment from the tall rider all the way down to a short rider. And one of the nice things about this is that we can get this in a position that'll make it easier for us to assemble, and then we can tighten that through axle down to hold it in place. As you can see here, we have all of our range of adjustment. We're just going to pick a spot for now. We'll probably move it up a little bit when we put our boom on to cradle in the chainstay. But see, once we tighten it down, then we can stash our tool in the axle, and now we're ready for the rear wheel installation. So same thing here, I have my rear through axle at the ready, and I'm simply going to lift up the back end and insert the wheel. Be careful not to scratch anything with the surface of the rotor, and line up that rotor in between the caliper and insert our through axle, and make sure it's nice and secure with the tool included with your axle. All right, now that our wheels are on, we can take a look at this front end. We have a lot going on with this front end, with some internal wiring, internal cabling for the front derailleur. So everything is sort of held together here. We're going to just kind of make sure everything looks good. We're going to move our pivot bolt clamp into position closer to the handlebar. And here we have our boom clamp bolts right there. It pushes an insert up against the boom. Now, to insert the main part of our slider, we're going to have our pinch bolt at the ready. It's pre-greased. Now, to make this a lot easier, I'm going to move this chainstay up to a little bit more vertical position. That's going to allow that bottom bracket shell to sit inside the chainstay and not move. So once we have that ready, we can set our handlebars down on the frame to be very careful. We can set our bottom bracket shell. Now if we have these pre-loosened a little bit, then we can slide this back and forth, in and out. If most of our attachments are snug, like the axle and the boom and slider interface, that will allow us to position it without it sliding off. So now we're going to insert our slide bolt with one washer on the outside, and the bolt with one washer on the outside goes on the other end. And we're just going to get this attached in there. We're not going to torque it down quite yet, because this is how we get our adjustment. All right, now let's take a look at the handlebars. A good position to start in is with the handlebars directly over or slightly behind the seat mount. So knowing that, we're going to tilt this entire unit back a little bit through the pivot clamp bolt. And get a preliminary setting there. Now our bottom bracket clamp, we need to get our torque wrench out. So we're going to check our torque sheet, and here we get our 4 bolts, 5mm bolts, meaning you need a 4mm Allen head, and we have our setting that we need for our torque wrench in Newton meters. All right, once we have that set, then we're going to do a preliminary attachment of our bottom bracket clamp. After we set our torque wrench, then we can take our clamp, where we have the threaded holes face up and forward. It does not fit the other direction, so it only fits really one way. And now we're going to take our pre-greased bolts, and we're going to do a preliminary attachment using our tool. So here I have my regular 4mm Allen. And just like handlebar clamps, or even our older bottom bracket clamps on the original chainstay, we want to make sure that there is an even gap between the top holes and the bottom holes. This is very important. We never want to tighten one side down all the way and then tighten the other side down. That's a surefire way to stress out the material and possibly cause a crack or a failure. So we want to make sure we tighten all of these down evenly, getting a preliminary fit with our hand tool, making sure there's a gap top and bottom. Here I'm holding my thumb and my first finger in between those pieces so I can kind of get a sense for the gap, making sure that one side is not getting too tight before tightening the other side down a little bit more. Now once you feel these get a little snug with a nice gap, then you know you're about ready to use your torque wrench to get that final attachment at the right torque. Here we're going to take our preset torque wrench. We're going to torque these down. Now we're going to, again, just like we did before, we're going to do even turns. Everything's going to start getting a little more snug as we do even amounts with each bolt until we feel one of them click. If it doesn't click right away, move on to the next one so we have nice even turns. There we go, there's one, clicked over. We're going to do the next one, click. Make sure you do not go past the click. Click. And then the final one gives us a nice click. Now we know we're at the proper torque for those attachments. All right, next let's talk about the boom and slider interface. So we don't have a boom clamp on the outside of the carbon fiber. We have an internal mechanism. So here we have our torque specs for those bolts. These bolts press up on a metal piece that interfaces with the boom. So just like before, we're going to make sure our torque setting is proper On our torque wrench, everything's basically just a little hand tight until we take our torque wrench to it. And again, even turns on each one, making sure everything gets snugged up at the same rate before we're able to hit that torque setting. All right, moving on down to the line to the handlebars, we're going to check our torque specs again for our torque specs for the handlebar clamps. Once we know what that is and we have our torque wrench set up, it's very easy to position the handlebars. If they're twisted, note again, there's only one real way that the cabling goes. If it's twisted a full turn, just give it another twist around and then you'll be fine. Now, once again, I'm going to use my regular Allen to get a pre-setting on this. Much easier to use a regular tool when you're just getting a quick assembly done, but you just don't want to tighten them more than just a little bit past snug. Then we will use our torque wrench to get the final setting. Here we're going to position the bars so that the vertical handheld section is out just a little bit. Kind of think of that between 7 and 8 o'clock position. Everybody's fit is different, but this is just a decent starting point. Just like we did on our bottom bracket clamp, we're going to make sure we have an even gap top and bottom between these clamps. And when we have an initial setting, then we can get our torque wrench out, make sure it's set properly, and then we can even turn each bolt one at a time. Just give it a nice even turn until you feel the click. Once we're pretty happy with that setting, we're going to make sure our press clamp is lowered all the way. It's already pre-installed, so all you have to do is use a 3mm Allen to loosen the bolt. And what that'll do is that will lower the Perez clamp as far down as we can get it, so that way our headrest tubes can slide easily past the two sections of the Perez clamp. Once they're in there, we can tighten up the Perez clamp a little bit, making sure it's nice and secure to hold those headrest tubes. Now, it does not have to be over tightened or anything like that. It just has to be snug. Here we have some of our seat mounting hardware. For the front, we have the 2 button head bolts, and we have 2 nylock nuts. We're going to take our carbon fiber seat pan. We'll insert our button head bolts through the pre-drilled holes in the base of the seat pan. Once we have that in there, we'll line up those bolt holes with the wings on the frame. It should slide straight on. We'll make sure we compress the seat down onto the frame, making sure the Velcro sticks nice and evenly. Once we have that done, we can take our nylock nuts and add them to the underside of the front seat. We should still be able to adjust and access our Perez clamp from the outside of the seat due to the mounting holes with access for the screws. All right, now we have our seat back yoke and we have 2 more button head bolts. Now this one is going to go through the upper part of the seat. We're going to very carefully position our yoke over the frame and as close to those holes as possible. So once we have everything lined up, it's going to take a little bit of pressure because of the carbon fiber seat, the way it bends back in the frame, to engage the threads in that seat back yoke and tighten up those bolts. Again, they do not have to be completely flush. They should have a little bit of a gap, mostly due to the fact that there is a double thickness of Velcro on the back of the seat and the frame. So we thread these bolts into the seat back yoke, making sure they're nice and tight, but not necessarily reef down super tight What we don't want are these fasteners bending the carbon fiber or sinking into it with the heads. Just make sure everything is nice and snug and there's no movement or play in the seat. Now we're going to take our Velcro attached to our pad, remove the adhesive backing, press it up against the seat, and we will attach our headrest to the headrest tubes, and there our seat and seat cushion is complete. Now we have an ungainly situation here with our cables. So we have a small piece that attaches to the underside of the slider that our cables go through, rather than having to zip tie around the tube. But before we do that, we're going to want to make sure all of our cable lengths are roughly the right length. The big anomaly and the one that's the odd one out is the internal one that goes to the front derailleur. This almost always is going to have to be set up individually for you. So if you are uncomfortable setting this cable, which comes very long for the tall riders, if you have to cut some cable off, I highly recommend that this particular step and maybe the complete assembly after this point be handled by a bike shop, because they will understand the need to check your fit, check your X seam, check your upward pedal stroke to make sure there's no interference before tightening that small piece, which we can see right there, that holds our cables, and it also doubles as the ability to hold a insert for a bottle cage. But before we put that on, we're going to want to make sure that we have set our distances. So this is the point where before wrapping these cables up, it's very important we know. Here's a shot where the cables go inside the little wings there, and then it holds them all nice and tight to the underside of the boom, just like in this picture. But before we know that, we need to know our front cable length. So there you're going to have to adjust the bike for your fit before realizing whether or not you have to cut some housing off of the front derailleur cable housing, which is very important to pull the cable out, or at least pull the cable out a little bit before you extend this particular piece of housing and insert it into this cable stop for the front derailleur. Because as we can see here, that cable can be really long or really short, and that's going to make the loop here by the handlebars much larger or much smaller than the rest of the cable housing, depending on your leg length. Okay, for the sake of this video, we're going to assume that we have the correct leg length. We've trimmed this cable housing down a little bit, and we have inserted our cable adjuster and our small section of housing at the very end as seen here. And then this cable, we're just going to manipulate it around the pulley and into the cable stop, you can see. And then this pulley is going to go down and around the pulley and then back up to the pinch bolt on the derailleur. Okay, now we have our cable routed through our pulley. You can see here the cable goes into the end of the stop, and we have it coming out of the frame. Now we can route this cable over the tab and into the groove for the front derailleur. This particular one has a small notch. The cable does not need to wrap around the bolt. It just goes in that notch, and then we're going to, one, make sure that the shifter is all the way downshifted into the lowest ring, and then we're going to attach the cable to the pinch bolt. Now it's very important that the cable go over the tab. So you can see here my finger is pointing at this tab. The cable goes over it. The cable always goes over the tab. A lot of people think the cable goes under the tab, but if you do that, there will never be enough leverage to shift the bike into the large ring. So always make sure your cable is going over the tab. As you can see here, it goes around the pulley and then back up to the shifter. All right, once again, we're going to check our torque for our pivot clamp section. As you can see here, we're going to want to get the proper torque setting for this. So for this one, we will have our torque wrench handy, and we will also have a second 5mm Allen handy, since both sides operate off the same 5mm Allen. So we're going to dial our torque wrench in for the level of torque that we need. And once we have that set, we can make any little adjustments we want to make. Now is a good time to sit on the bike, check that leg length, check that distance from pedal to the top of your leg for the pedal stroke. And once we have that, we can hold the 1 bolt steady on the one side, and on the other side we can turn that torque wrench until we feel it click. Then we will know we have reached the right torque for the front end. All right, now we can go over our chain installation. We're going to have our quick link and our chain at the ready. The easiest way I have found is to lower the chain into and over the top of the derailleur cage. Let it sit on the small ring or even off the small ring if you want, depending on how much slack you need. Then our chain is going to go around the lowest cog, which should be preset from the factory. And then we will go around the back end of the cassette. We will go down, drop through, avoiding the tab on the derailleur. And then we want to route that chain around the back side of the other jockey wheel, just like this. That'll give us a nice smooth chain line without any rubbing on any metal parts. All right, now we're going to take our quick link. We're going to insert it on both sides of the chain. Now, you can rotate this around to the top of the chain and exert pressure on the crank to engage the quick link. I'm just going to use my handy little chain link tool, and I'm going to close this quick link, and that means our chain is fully installed. Every complete cruise bike includes a set of pedals. So here, if you look on the inside, you'll see a left or a right. We will pre-grease the threads of our pedals, and we will install them on the correct side using either the 15mm open end wrench included with your toolkit, or our own tools, or a 6 or 8mm Allen. Depending on the pedals we get, they will be able to attach either with an Allen or with the pedal wrench. Make sure they're nice and secure, and then repeat for the other side. Now take note on your Complete where your handlebars are situated in relation to your grips. These ones are a little too far forward for us to get good braking. So what I'm going to do in this particular case is I'm going to loosen the hood. The rubber hood opens up, and you'll see a 5mm Allen. That will allow you to tweak the position of these road shifters. I prefer them to be back further on the top of the arc of the curve in the handlebars, and then I'm going to tighten it again. You may or may not need to unwrap your grip tape in doing this. In this case, I'm able to adjust them pretty easily without doing any damage to the rim tape, but it will make the braking feel that much better having them located further up onto the handlebar curve as opposed to having it set way down like it was before. And here you can see in the transition the new position of the hoods. I much prefer this. It gives a much better braking feel. And that concludes our build of the Cruzbike V20c. As with any advanced bike, the adjustments will need to be made to make sure your shifting and your brakes work handily on the Complete. Make sure you do that before your first ride. And also make sure you follow the torque specs should you need to make adjustments to your front end, especially in those initial days when you are getting everything dialed in for your fit. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at support@cruzbike.com in the email or also on our web forum, a great place for assistance or other ideas for you and your cruise bike. This has been Robert. Thank you so much and happy riding.